The amazing Skoda story began in 1895, over 100 years ago, in the town of Mladá Boleslav, which is about an hour's drive north of Prague, with a bookseller called Václav Klement and a mechanic called Laurin. On a business trip to Paris in 1899, Laurin brought back a bicycle, and he made some improvements to that bicycle. And from there on in, the company started selling worldwide. And in fact, the first major order went to an English company, 150 bicycles.
Business thrived, but Klement, he was an ambitious man, and he had heard of motorised bicycles being used in other parts of Europe, and decided that this was what he wanted to get into next. The engines of other motorcycles were placed in all sorts of odd and awkward places. Laurin had designed the bike where the engine was actually put in the middle of the frame, low down on the chassis, thus creating an excellent centre of gravity, something that no other bicycle manufacturer had thought of before. By 1901, Klement was already thinking of four-wheel motorised transport. Some 4 years down the line, he came out and introduced his first motor car, the Type A, a very sophisticated car for its time. It had a V-twin engine of 1100 cc's, producing 6 or 7 brake horsepower. There was a 3-speed gearbox and a reverse gear. And one interesting part was that you could actually buy the car either with chain driven or with a propeller drive shaft.
And another significant vehicle at the time, between 1911 and 1915, was the Phaeton, which was a very elegant, sporting car, which had an all-ash body and a beautiful veneer finish. The First World War really broke up the production of motor vehicles, and so the company Laurin and Klement had to concentrate on producing military-style equipment and tanks. So, returning to civilian vehicle production after the First World War, the new democratic Czech Republic was able to re-enter the world automotive market, and Laurin and Klement cars could be found on the roads of Mexico, Amsterdam, Europe, Central European markets, absolutely everywhere. In 1925, Laurin and Klement really felt the sales crisis at that time, made them seek a partner. And that partner was found in the Skoda company, an industrial company based in Pilsen.
Skoda was an enormous company producing locomotives, train, aero engines, and components for large ships. They also produced cars. One of the most famous cars they produced was, under license, the Hispano Suiza, a car which had a reputation second to none in mainland Europe. It really was the top end of the luxury range and had a reputation that went worldwide. Skoda continued to market Laurin and Klement cars. In fact, the first Skoda cars that manufactured also carried the Laurin and Klement badge. This only continued for a couple of years, and thereafter any future models designed by Skoda themselves would only carry the Skoda emblem. In 1933, Skoda came out with one of the most radical designs of the time. The car that was launched was called the 420 initially, and was subsequently to be called the Popular.
This is a Skoda Popular, 1938, which I acquired in Prague in 1989. It was built to provide daily transport for Czechoslovakian people. There is a an enormous level of ignorance where the Skoda mark is concerned. You park it somewhere and they all look at the badge and go, shaking of the head, I didn't know they made them at that time. It's a standard response. And then if you've got enough energy, you then give them the 5-minute potted history of Skoda cars. For its age, in 1938, it was a very advanced car. Engine-wise, it was a little 1000cc overhead valve unit, which was, unheard of in most of the major European manufacturers, especially in the United Kingdom. She has independent front suspension, a tubular backbone chassis, electric start on the engine. You don't always have to wind the handle. An advanced wee car in every way. Where this little car stands out as a mass-produced unit, and I think we must emphasise that, is that it's the detail. The little fluted side light mouldings. It's got sensitivity and it's rather special. So there was a great deal of artistic flair, skill, imagination that they managed to employ.
The Popular was to prove one of the most successful vehicles ever produced by Skoda. It sold throughout Europe. The car was sold in places as far off as Australia and the Far East. It was to prove a landmark in the history of the company.
She's right-hand drive because she's pre-Hitler's invasion of Czechoslovakia, which is 39. She was born in 38. After the invasion, he ordered them to drive on the other side of the road, hence, the left-hand drive vehicles from there on in. When we bought her, she was in fact up and running, albeit with a slightly noisy engine. I'm quite sensitive to the fact that she was in the same family in Prague from day one. And although we have, done a fair degree of the refurbishment, one aspect I'm very keen to preserve is the originality of the trim, because although it may be a wee bit farmyardish, it sort of exudes character, 1938 type smells, or maybe that's my overactive imagination. But I don't want to make her too pretty for the sake of, spoiling the originality. She's a character. It is helped now that she's got brakes. The engine has been completely rebuilt. We have a minor rattle off the timing chain, which we're going to live with. I think one has to keep it in context. She will march along happily all day and all night at about 45 miles an hour, although they're reputed to have been quicker in their day. And no, she's a lady.
Hitler marched unchallenged into Czechoslovakia, and very soon the factory was under the control of the Wehrmacht. Most of the production was put towards the ammunition and the production of shells. The final day of the war, the remnants of the Luftwaffe in Czechoslovakia took off to go home. On their way home, they bombed Mladá Boleslav, virtually destroying the factory. For what reason? Nobody knows. But I suspect that this was one way of the Germans getting back for the lack of cooperation of the Czech people during the war.
So after the Second World War, the political climate was completely different. Czechoslovakia entered a very dark period in its history when the communists were in power. It purely existed in its own domestic arena without any interaction from the outside world. And despite those gloomy times, they were very inventive, and they used their skills and craftsmanship to develop not just a utilitarian vehicle, but this beautiful Felicia, a sports car, a roadster, which to people in Central Europe at that time was the car of their dreams.
She was a character. It is helped now that she's got brakes. The engine has been completely rebuilt. We have a minor rattle off the timing chain, which we're going to live with. I think one has to keep it in context. She will march along happily all day and all night at about 45 miles an hour, although they're reputed to have been quicker in their day. And no, she's a lady.
The classic Felicia, manufactured between 1959 and 1964. Its name means happiness, which comes from the Latin.
I came by it by being on holiday in Czechoslovakia, as it was then, and I heard about the car being renovated by an ex-Skoda engineer. So went along to see it, and fell in love with it immediately. And I said I'd go back and buy it a couple of months later when it was finished. But a fortnight before we were due to go, we heard that the engineer who had renovated it had to be taken into hospital. So we feared for the state of the car, but we were assured that in typical Czech there's no problem. Anyway, we went over there and found that the car had been finished off by his son-in-law, who was a bit of a cowboy, so none of the detailed stuff seemed to work very well. We set off in the rain, me driving the left-hand drive for the first time. And the darkness fell and we switched the headlights on and they immediately pointed at the sky. Every time we went down a hill, the twin carbs seemed to be pulling in different directions because there were flames out the exhaust. Then we switched indicators on, found that the left indicator was indicating right, and so on. Then we set off down the ramp to the ferry, banging and crashing from the exhaust, parked on the ferry, and thank goodness had a good dinner and a night's rest, and got to Hull the next morning. I got to a garage, stopped for petrol, and found I had a terrific petrol leak. It was pouring out underneath as fast as I was pouring it in. But we managed to fix that, and we eventually got the 180 miles home.
Skoda's marketing in the 50s was very hesitant, and the language they used was double Dutch. I can't imagine why they were unable to get in communist Czechoslovakia somebody who could translate English more effective than they seemed to manage. If I can just quote from one of the brochures, "Experiences accumulated for years were expressed in these types by all desirable advantages." I've no idea what that actually means. However, by the early 60s, Skoda was seriously marketing in this country. The early 60s brochures were not only very glamorous, but showed a great deal of humour. The Octavia brochure, I remember, in 1961, has a series of family photographs on holiday. In it, one of the daughters writes a letter home to her friend, telling them what a wonderful time they were having in their new car. This kind of technique was used 20-odd years later by Citroën, but it's not the kind of advertising you expect of Skoda at this period.
Another thing that appealed to me was the fact that with these cars, as there were no service stations available in Czechoslovakia except on the very main roads, the cars were designed and the equipment with the car was provided so that you could in fact do a major overhaul at the roadside, which quite often you had to do. In the boot of this car, as well as the petrol tank, which is in one side, on the other side you've got a 20-litre jerry can, which is part of the equipment and strapped in. And this is intended to see you to the next place where you can buy petrol, which could be a long way away. This car came out originally in 1959, and there was a saloon version and also an estate version at the same time. But of course the convertible was much rarer. It was slightly dearer than the other cars and therefore it didn't sell so well. And of course, being a convertible, it had to be looked after and garaged, and a lot of them weren't garaged, and the hood rotted and the water got in, and therefore there are not many of them about now. In fact, there are only two that I know of in this country that are running on the roads or capable of doing so. It's very great fun to drive, particularly when you're driving through towns and people suddenly stop in their tracks and look at it and say, what's that, you know.
The Felicia and the Octavia were dramatically successful, and the factory continually had problems keeping up with demand, primarily because of their relatively old-fashioned techniques of production. With this in mind, they made a momentous decision to build a new factory. The engineers were sent out into the world to look at what was available at the time. A lot of companies were running rear-engine cars. Volkswagen were running the Beetle, Renault were running rear-engine cars. They decided that that was the route to go down. So when they came back, they designed what was to be the 1000 MB.
The car's called a 1000 MB. The 1000 tells you that it's got a 1000cc engine. The MB is for Mladá Boleslav, which is the location of the Škoda factory. 25 years ago, I insisted I wanted to restore this enormous great MG, and my father said, "You're mad, what do you want a great big thing like that?" But with the wisdom of all 18-year-olds at the time, yeah, I bought it. 25 quid off an old gentleman in Ruislip, who was a Czech émigré who'd been over here, been on Wellington bombers with the RAF in the war and just stayed in England. He sold me the car, and to my shame, I never took it for him to see when I finished it. And I guess in about 1993, Skoda head office phoned us up and said, you're into old Skodas. Someone's rung us up, they want to get rid of one, give them a call. So I did. When I came to ask where I could go and see it and got the name and address, suddenly I realised it was the self-same man who'd sold me the MG in 1960-something, who died, and this was his car. So we had to buy it. Having the engine in the back means all sorts of other things move to the front. For example, the petrol cap and tank. And on each front wing there's a decorative little badge with a moulding flash along it. The secret is that one side you pull a lever and out pops the badge, and that's where the petrol goes. Similarly, at the front of the car, what would normally be the grille, of course, is just a panel. There's no need to draw air in through the front of the car. That comes in through the grilles that you can see at the side. Again, you pull another little lever and the front panel with the badge drops down, and there's the spare wheel and the toolkit tucked away under the luggage boot floor. Luggage space is in the front. Again, it's not huge. That's another problem with most rear-engine cars, that there's not a huge amount of space for luggage. But on this particular car, the rear seats fold down to give you access to a little boot behind the seats. Additionally, which is probably unique but must have been rather fun at the time, both front seats will fold down flat so that you can lie down in the car. I'll leave it at that. When this car was new, it would have cost you about £680, which sounds like nothing. But 30 years ago, you could buy, I guess, a Morris Minor for about £550, maybe £600, depending on the model. So it wasn't a cheap car then. To drive, the car is a baby. It's very docile. I think it's nicer than the ones that came perhaps 10 years later. It's smooth to drive, and it will still clock along at 80 miles an hour, so it's okay, yeah. The rear-engine period, which started with the 1000 MB, then progressed to another model that was just called a number. It was the S100 or the 110.
In the late 60s, Skoda was still marketing very sophisticatedly, and their brochures had an element of humour about them. One which features motor racing scenes, which clearly would not be appropriate for Skoda, but how they get away with it, have a small boy carrying the motor racing helmet round, they have a small boy with a model racing car. Another particularly delightful brochure features a kitten. The kind of cute animal that you might get in a toilet roll advert these days was used by Czechoslovakia in the late 60s, and so throughout this brochure the kitten appears.
Then was the Estelle, which most people associate with Skoda, mainly because thousands and thousands of them were sold in the UK, and it had a two-door coupe counterpart which is called the Rapid.
The Skoda jokes, I think, started with the Mark I Estelle when that came out, because its road holding wasn't really equivalent to the road holding of the Western cars, and a lot of people sort of got in it and ended up by going into the nearest field. So it got a very bad reputation. But in fact it was unjustified in a way, because within a couple of years they had straightened the whole thing out, and from then on there was nothing wrong with Skoda cars at all, but of course the bad image lingered on.
Ridiculously, the marketing actually began to present the car as if it was sophisticated. So early 70s brochures have cars in the hunting scenes, have a car alongside a pedigree racehorse.
The Velvet Revolution happened in 1989, and after 14 days of peaceful demonstration, the country returned to democracy, and the race was on for the factory. Volkswagen eventually became the winners of this competition, and in 1992 effectively took control of Skoda.
Skoda celebrated its centenary in 1995 with the launch of a brand new car, and this new car, the Felicia, was the result of the metamorphosis of the whole brand.
For the price of an ordinary hatch, I got alloy wheels, colour-coded bumpers, electric front windows, sunroof, and still had enough left over to buy something to play with. The Skoda Bohemia Special Edition, £8,299 on the road.
Skoda have decided to launch a new model. This is called the Octavia. It's a larger car, Mondial-sized car, but I think the important thing to bear in mind is that it still will be an affordable car for the private buyer.
What I like about Skoda is that it's that little bit different to the run-of-the-mill car. It always has been. Not in the same way as that somebody might be a Ferrari enthusiast, but they're individualistic people who have a very no-nonsense idea of what they want a car to be.